and these clerks are stupid and also the judges and the administrators and attorneys are being really stupid too, because the clerk is actually the bank. Okay, he's responsible for the public record and the books. If the administrators are manipulating the books, do you understand? By preventing laws and paperwork from being properly documented, then you have corruption in the bank. Okay, and when you have corruption in the bank, you have junk bonds. Okay, see what's happening. What people don't understand about law is that it's a commoditized construct right now. We are operating in commercial law in all respects. Commercial law up to the bar of equity, as we've talked about.
And what about and there's basically mostly the two courts that my show and the people that tune in are involved in are the family courts and the children's courts. And it's my understanding that those involve establishment law. Okay, well, where is that written? Exactly. That's what and the other thing is, what is establishment law? I'm not familiar with that jurisdiction in the Constitution. I don't think I've ever heard the word establishment law. Establishment law sounds like fascism to me. It's the same thing as like when they, in this case that we're in, where they basically are clearly violating their own internal administrative policies and stuff, and you prove this to them, and then they this last guy at the end, Administrator Watson, which he basically he was so frustrated with what he was obligated to do, he basically made every motion or every response and anything that was ever put on the docket by either side, including his magistrate, moot. Like, he basically struck them off the record and called everything moot, even his own underlings' arguments on behalf of the court, okay? So, and says Rucker-Feldman doctrine, okay? It's like the catch-all, be-all. They either say lack of jurisdiction, you're not an attorney, or the Rucker-Feldman doctrine. The Rucker-Feldman doctrine, the principle is you haven't satisfied the qualification of the child being in the custody of the state. It's like, okay, are we playing games here? Yeah, what is define custody of the state? Okay, who is the state? Are we playing a torning games here? Mm-hmm. So they're trying to legally disappear people. For a court to tell you and I, or anybody of any moral turpitude and common sense, if a court says to you, well, the child is not in the custody of the state, in quotations, and Rucker-Feldman, a common person goes, well, whose custody is he in? Well, that's the crisis. That's the crux of the situation. That's the crisis, because quite literally they're disappearing children.
Well, I understand that, because but let's just think of the metaphor. This is a great metaphor. And then we'll address the fact that, like, for example, in Ohio, the state statutes define the child as always in state custody. So how can the state statutes, if Title IV-E and Title IV programs are supposed to be locally driven and also maintained and monitored for compliance, if the state statutes say the child is in state custody, why would the feds not say this child, if the statutes say the child's always in state custody, no matter if he's in foster care or with CPS workers or anything, that this child is always the ward, custody, whatever of the state, that the state is always the holder of the custody. If the state statutes say that, how can a federal court, or any court, but the federal courts in general are the ones throwing the Rucker-Feldman around, say that the child is not in the custody of the state? And then it's like, is this an ends legis game that you're trying to, because to me that's constructive fraud just on the face of it. Mm-hmm. Because it'd be like this. Every parent is confused when they hear it. Even an attorney, I want to add something. Attorney.
I want to interject something, Lotus, if that's okay. Yes. I just want to interject one thing. There is no statutes for fraud on the court.
What do you mean by that?
There's no statutes of limitations for fraud when you can prove fraud on the court.
Oh, well, there's no statutes of limitations on fraud, period. That's a law of equity.
Yeah. Okay.
Fraud, you can sue for fraud, wink, wink, over 205 years later. All right, wink, wink, from 1812. There's no statute of limitation on fraud. And if it's constructive fraud, you could even still retroactively demand compensatory and punitive damages. Mm-hmm. If you're operating, for example, in implied contracts, which are unconstitutional and against the common law. Because, again, let's talk about that. So basically what the federal government is saying, okay, let's think about this. So a state agency took your child, and now a court is saying he's not in the custody of the state. And we're not going to interfere, even though crimes may have been committed by court officers in violation of federal and state statute. But we're not going to interject because the child's not in state custody. Okay, that right there implies that they're trafficking children, just on the face of it. Because what they're saying is, okay, so the way I read that the first time I heard it is like, okay, so you stole the kid and now he's not in custody, and you think, oh, well, that's kind of like I stole your car and sold it to someone and now I can't be charged with it. It's like they're saying we're not going to interfere with the state stealing your child and giving it to someone else.
And that's the issue. That's the real issue here, is that there is no accountability for the parents.
Well, interesting you should say accountability, as in accounts, because, see, the state is being contracted by the United States corporation, okay, the federal corporation, to go seize the children. They're actually paying them. They have contracted them to do what, though? They have contracted them to comply with the federal statutes. Okay, so we're going back to what I talked about earlier. So the executive branch has agreed to work with the state executive officers and agencies and pay them to comply with these statutes. And statutes are bonded, by the way, a bond. So the federal government contracted the state executive branch to help children under these statutes. The judiciary is supposed to be making sure that the executive branch of the state and the agents of those executive branch are in compliance with the contracted federal law they're getting paid to follow. Mm-hmm. And they're not doing that. So again, the courts are not doing their job because they're not, and that goes up into the federal level. And they're not making the states, and the state courts.
This goes for like funding, federal funding that they receive for
right.
Fee waivers, for
anything.
Yeah, any kind of.
The states are in contract with the federal government. If you look at most state CAFR accounts, like I think, and I could be quoting this wrong, but people should check this. You should look at your state CAFRs, whatever, however you say, the secret, the side books, okay, the real ledger that they keep, where their true trust assets are. And you'll see that most states probably, except for maybe, I think California says they're not, but then they get all this money for bridges, right? But most states take millions of dollars from the federal government in grants. I think Ohio, it's almost 1/3 of their operating capital, okay? Mm-hmm. And then they're bonding through municipal bonds the other, 70%, the income, and it's like, where's all this, So the states are getting paid.
I have parents calling me and telling me that, they're on disability and they can't get a fee waiver. But the clerk, and then you ask them, well, do you receive federal funding for the fee waivers? And they're like, if I call and they're like, oh, well, yeah, you need to talk to the supervisor and maybe we can figure out how to get a fee waiver.
I think what it is the administrative process has not been written. And here's why. And this is the stickiness and why we have to create the path where, because in this particular case, when it comes to children, remember I told you that's really the manifest destiny of our government, our concepts of philosophy of living, is that we have a manifest destiny to create a system of state that is neutral, that has a neutrality to it and serves everyone in equity and protects children and gives every natural born entity in this reality the right to own their capita, their intellectual property, the proceeds of their intellect, and also to ensure, as we are all created equal, that we all have, both corporately and in the eyes of God, okay, and that we have the obligation to create a system where everyone has an equal share in this reality. If you're white,
you just filed something this week to make sure that they're implementing these statutes.
Right. Well, what we did is in the case with Clay, we have an aunt who's from another territory, a state of Indiana, and she was denied custody of the child, even though she was pre-qualified by federal guidelines, like literally was qualified in the state of Ohio through the Department of Job and Family Services and the county that the child was seized in. She was qualified in kinship placement. She was also qualified by Indiana CPS to take kinship. So basically, because she had applied to adopt an older child, a 14-year-old, and had to get qualified in both states for them to relinquish custody. Now, mind you, it took her 3 years to get custody of a child that was actually in a juvenile detention home and wasn't even placed in a foster system and wasn't even being educated in high school. This was 14-year-old. He was basically put in a child prison because he hated where he was and he knew that they'd stolen him, so he was being rebellious.
And when a lot of these kids are put in foster homes and put in the jurisdiction of the state, that is like jail. That's like child jail.
No, by all definitions, he's in prison, because if you look at the definition of prison, is when you are taken from, you are arrested and your physical body is being controlled in the custody of the state to be living or be put somewhere against your will. Children are taken and seized and arrested, and they are removed from their family and put in foster care. It's a prison. I guarantee you, emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, to that child feels the same way as someone who is ripped off the street, arrested, and thrown into prison. And probably worse, because they don't have the capacity to talk and speak about their imprisonment. And I have the habeas corpus the writ of habeas corpus that I filed with the state of Ohio. I said that I was like, you put him in prison. He's in prison. The mother's in prison and the child's in prison. The child was arrested and seized unlawfully. The state was obligated to follow due process for the seizure of an adult, but the state just seems to think that it can take a child who can't speak for itself and completely violate 100% every aspect of due process and everything, and stick these kids in prisons that they committed no crime. And they're deprived of, that's the whole point of Title IV. You are never supposed to remove a child from the custody of a family that has, even if there's been a murder, in the family, they're supposed to attempt to put that child with other family members. It's not like the whole family is supposed to be indicted for the behavior of even one adult in the family. They're supposed to find familial associations to continue to raise this child, because
I actually wrote up a template, which is a temporary guardianship template, which it's in the porthole to justice, so parents can have that prepared proactively if there is a situation in their family.
Right, but they shouldn't even have to, because
what I'm saying is, if they don't have that prepared...
Right, that's a legal instrument, you're right, and that's a good thing, but even still, and you and I both know this, even if there's a guardianship in place, they can still bring the child in. It just is one more hurdle. It shows intent.
And if you don't exercise your rights and you don't document it, then you don't have it.
That's not true. In that respect, that's not true, because just because you don't surrender to their legal construct and put the fact that the child is the custody of the family, the child is the property of its God-given family, does not make you surrender the right to say that.
I know that it shouldn't be that way, but
that's why I said, it's good. It's a legal document, but that legal document is not supposed to be a requirement pursuant to the way Title IV is written. We're not supposed to have to be writing private contract documents, legal documents between family members to try to throw wrenches of legal, quote, fact, which, into their corruptions to try to keep our children from being stolen.
But see, that's the key word, the corruptions, because the courts aren't following the due process. They're not looking into kinship care like they're supposed to. They're putting the children directly into foster care, the jail, the jurisdiction of the courts. And so, I created that template so that parents could be proactive.
It definitely is something. I'm going to tell you this. If people are being harassed in any way, shape, or form,
and the state is interfering in your life, I don't care if it's tax fraud questions, I don't care what it is. If the state has stepped into your life at this point in time with as abusive as the state has become because of the abuses of the instruments by very nefarious and corrupted and unlawful people, then you should be setting up. Well, and you should do that anyway when you have a child, just like a will.
No, well, I have it set up just in case, and so I published it